Pope Francis raised some eyebrows recently because he really parted from Christian and Catholic doctrine and made some overtly secular observations. He said, quote, "When we read about creation in Genesis, we run the risk of imagining God was a magician with a magic wand able to do everything. But that is not so. He created human beings and let them develop according to the internal laws that he gave to each one, so they would reach their fulfillment. The Big Bang, which today we hold to be the origin of the world, does not contradict the intervention of the divine creator, but rather requires it. Evolution in nature is not inconsistent with the notion of creation because evolution requires the creation of beings that evolve." So, yet again, this pope is showing himself to be much more liberal, much more progressive, much more secular, much smarter than many, many, many previous popes. And up until now, he's given credit to, or he said certain things that are somewhat kind to the LGBT community. He's even said some kind things about atheists, which is fairly surprising. I think he said something along the lines of, well, if you're a good person and you treat people right and you just have a crisis of faith, who am I to judge? Maybe maybe you can get into heaven. I remember covering this story, I don't know, what was it, about a year ago or so? So, yet again, he's continuing with that trend. Now, of course, I'm of the opinion that you could always do more if you're part of some dogmatic religious institution. You should go as far in the direction of liberalism and secularism and science as possible, but that's wishful thinking, and that's naive on my part to want, a religious figure to go even more in that direction. But here's the thing. I think this is both good, as I'm trying to describe, but also there's a downside to it as well. See, I think Pope Francis is smart enough to know, and there are some leaders in some religious institutions who are smart enough to know that it's either evolve or die. That either these religions are going to become more secular in a way, become more progressive, or they're just going to be left in the dustbin of history for having nothing but pure bad ideas that nobody pays attention to, and you're just a bunch of old cranks dressed up in dresses acting like you run the world. So there's that aspect to it as well, that if you really are, from a purely atheistic perspective, if you're somebody who, like me, wants religion to basically become what it should be, which is something only 5-10% of the world population believes in, and even they don't take it literally. I want religion to know its place. If you're part of that school of thought, or you're part of the school of thought that doesn't want religion really at all, well, then the downside to this is they're trying to evolve to continue to be relevant, and when they do stuff like this, I think they do become more relevant. So again, the upside is, well, you have a more inclusive and a smarter church, Catholic Church in this case. They're not as hard on gay people and atheists, and they're more open to the Big Bang and evolution, so they're much smarter, which is a good thing in and of itself, for sure. But again, the downside is it does make them more relevant, and then it's harder for secular people and agnostics and atheists who are right to come along and say, well, you should drop the whole thing because the whole thing is silly. Because, look, in the end tally, the entire thing is pretty silly. And the final thing that I'll lay out there about this, the points he makes are also not true. I mean, he's right to believe in the Big Bang and to believe in evolution, which is the overall point here, but the specific points he makes are actually wrong when he says, in order for the Big Bang to happen, there basically has to be a God that makes the Big Bang happen in the first place. That's not true. That's not true, because who made God then? That's the idea that, well, if something happened, there needs to be a father to that thing. If something is very complex and designed, it needs a designer. That's the basic argument. And like I always say, well, then who designed the designer? Is there a super God that created a God and then the God created us? Because if you're saying we need to have somebody or something that created us, that created the Big Bang, well, then again, by that same logic, wouldn't you need somebody to create the thing that created the Big Bang? So that's not true. And to be clear, I don't know. That's all I say. That's all any atheist or agnostic says, is that let's be honest, let's be humble, let's not say we know that there was a God that created the Big Bang, because we don't know. Nobody knows. So just be honest and say that. So he's wrong to assume that there had to have been a God which led to the Big Bang. I love how I'm laying this out there as if like the Pope is going to listen and go, you know, that Kyle guy, he made a good point. Let me as Pope say I don't no longer believe in a God. Never going to happen, but I'm just, for clarity's sake, I'm laying out here where I think he's wrong. And then also on the issue of evolution, he's right that a lot of people conflate two things. A lot of creationists or a lot of religious folks conflate the idea of abiogenesis, which is the study of the very first life form that ever existed, the beginning of life, and evolution. They act like those things are one and the same. They're not one and the same. They're two separate things. Evolution, we know, is basically a fact. We know it's happened. There's a ton of evidence for it, and it's provable. So we know that's real. We don't know exactly what led to the first creation of the first living thing, whatever it may have been, an amoeba, a bacteria, I don't know, anything else, whatever it was. And there are some ideas, you know, in primordial soup, you have the building blocks that are there. All it would take is like a lightning strike, and then that could create the first single-celled thing, and then the ball just gets rolling, and eventually how many billions of years later, or millions of years later, you have human beings. So, but even in respect to that, it's not true that we need a God to do the abiogenesis part and then evolution happens. No, again, we don't know. It's not necessary. It's possible, but it's not necessary for to invoke a God to explain it. That, again, is the God of the gaps argument that we see all the time from disingenuous right-wingers who try to make everything about Jesus every 4 seconds. So the overall point, I am leaning more on the side of happy that the Catholic Church is more open to gay people, more open to atheists, and they're now accepting the Big Bang and evolution. But still, you could still see the flaws within the arguments even when they say the right things. And the downside is this does make them more relevant, and it does make it a little harder for people like myself and atheists and agnostics to come along and say, drop the entire thing because the entire thing is a fallacy and it's made up.